I will give you my take, aided by a 60-minute or so intensive seminar on the existence or not of a real estate bubble in the GTA at an investors forum event where I had the privilege of moderating the panel yesterday. So here's what I see. I have a huge caution sign, a huge yellow light up with some red flags flying around it. So it's not quite a red light yet or a kind of disaster situation, but I start with my old theory, which is, I think, reality, not just a theory, and that is that nothing happens by accident in politics. You've heard me say this before. So when you get Canada's finance minister visiting the editorial boards of both the Globe and Mail and the National Post on one day, on Friday, to express concern about the housing market, I would say that's a reason to have a yellow light up. They just don't do that sort of thing unless there's a reason for it. When the same finance minister goes out of his way to criticize developers, you may have seen this certainly in the Globe article, for continuing to build condos, in effect, he's saying, waiting for the musical chair's music to just stop and whoever falls down on the floor, too bad for them, that's a yellow light to me. When the very same finance minister criticizes the banks for offering a 2.99% mortgage, saying they're on kind of a race to the bottom to see who can offer the silliest low interest rate, why would he criticize that? I mean, that's the marketplace at work, but because he's worried. That's why, I think. And that's a yellow light, if not a red flag or two. But let's forget the finance minister and look at what's going on in that marketplace that is the GTA housing marketplace in particular. Demand? Yes, no question. There is real demand driven by immigration. Absolutely. Still tens of thousands of people moving to this city region, and we want that to continue to happen. But it's also driven by foreign investors who buy those condos on the theory it's a safe haven for their money in a stable place like Toronto. They very much rely, though, on renting those condos out. And so a lot of the marketplace success, I'll call it, or whatever you want to call it, so far has been driven by renters too. They rent those condos in lieu of rental apartments which aren't being built. That's a subject for another day too, because they're not being built because there are rent controls on which make them unattractive as a business proposition. The yellow flag problem? The price of the condos has risen such that now the cost of renting them has gone out of the reach of many tenants. So people will go to a 500 square foot condo and they'll be told it rents for $2,000 a month because that's what the owner, the foreign investor, has to charge to make up his or her mortgage payments. That is a yellow flag to me, that foreign investors are starting to say, the amount I'd have to pay for that condo, I can't really recover in rent because there's not a lot of people out there that can pay $2,000 a month. How about interest rates? Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney has basically promised. He's basically promised. Remember I read that statement to you last week where he used these sort of funny words they use? But he's saying interest rates are going up later this year. Not next year, this year. And I ask you, how many of you borrowed on the basis of those low interest rates, just making the rent versus own equation work for you? Just barely, like over the line by a few bucks, and you said, okay, I'll go for it, because the rates are low. And have you done the calculation of what's going to happen to you if the rates go up 2%? And if you have done it, and you're one of the people that'll be in trouble if rates go up 2%, that's a yellow flag, not just for you, but because your condo will then be on the market. But guess what? So will a lot of other people's at the same time, and the law of supply and demand says that pushes prices down. And finally, one more general statistic. Household debt to income ratios now see our level of household debt surpassing that of the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, you can say that's bad or good. What it does mean, though, I think, is that people have less financial flexibility in their lives if something happens. And that means some of them will be forced to sell their condos. Trouble is, a lot of them will be forced to sell it at the same time, which means there'll be a glut on the market of condos and, for that matter, houses, too. What's suggested in some of the articles that are being written, and I've seen it in a number of things I read preparing for this seminar that I moderated yesterday, is what they call hot money that has been in its travels through a number of different countries, China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and then through to Vancouver and now into Toronto, where it's money coming principally from Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, where literally people are buying condos 50 and 100 at a time. And then they are renting them out or hoping to rent them out. And, of course, the whole thing starts to come unraveled when one of two things happens. Either they stop all the buying And there's actually been laws passed in some countries saying you just can't have foreign ownership of these kinds of units. For example, in China and Hong Kong, foreigners are banned and locals are restricted to one mortgaged unit and a second one only if they pay cash for it. The Swiss, as you know, for years have had a quota on foreign purchases and allow one unit as a second residence for the exclusive use of the owner. They have very heavy taxes in some countries in Europe to try and discourage this kind of thing. I mean, when we sold our condo a year and a half ago, we sold it to a Venezuelan. And I said at the seminar yesterday, if I lived in a country run by a crazy man like that Chavez, who's, I think, totally nuts and a complete communist, then I would be looking for a place to invest some of my money, too, if I had any. So I'm not surprised that a Venezuelan person would buy a condo in Toronto. Nor am I surprised necessarily that when the day of reckoning might come to China and some of these countries that have been on fire, if you had money in those countries, Russia, you'd probably look for places to invest that are relatively tranquil, like Canada. So I'm not surprised at all this, but I'm just saying, well, it isn't normal either to have that going on, this so-called hot money. And hot not meaning it's stolen or made through illicit purposes, but just that it's kind of hot in that it's moving around and locating itself in places. I think of the lot of young people today and sort of think, well, wow, I mean, it's a difficult sort of equation. I've advised a couple of young people to go and buy something now and borrow to some extent. Don't go crazy borrowing, but the interest rates are where they are, and that's not going to repeat itself again soon. The lowest mortgage we ever had on our houses, and as long as we had a mortgage, which is for a long time, was at 10%. The lowest one we ever had. So I look at mortgages being available now at 2.99% and say to myself, well, wow. The guys yesterday, just as a matter of interest, when I was moderating this panel of these experts, they said we should never get into the trap of saying, well, because New York is this or London's that, we are not New York or London. They're not saying we're smaller. They're just saying we are our own marketplace here, and that you can't sort of say, well, because it's cheaper than New York, therefore it's okay.
There's a bit of a shift from developers away from condos a little bit to rental accommodation, which is not a bad thing at all. It's a good thing. But the bottom line is people are still making decisions, smart people who have a lot of money at stake and their lenders, to invest here in Toronto to build residential and commercial buildings. And so I'm assuming they're pretty smart people. They know what they're doing, and that we should continue to provide a welcoming place for them to make that investment here, and that otherwise there's nothing I can do as the Mayor of Toronto about interest rates or about the global economy or any of these kinds of things, just to keep an eye on things. And my assignment is more to say, when we're building these office buildings and these condos, are we making sure we have the parks, the transit, the recreation centers, the schools, to take all the people who are going to live in those buildings and look after them properly as residents of Toronto. So that's really my job. But I just think that the marketplace will look after itself in terms of housing prices. You hope it doesn't get too overheated, but again, it's a marketplace, and none of us in politics should try to control that. We should just hope that those who are making the investments are prudent people, which I believe they are.